On the Majority Report on the phone, it is a pleasure to welcome to the program Emeritus Professor of History of Medicine from Yale University, author of Epidemics and Society, From Black Death to the Present, Yale historian Frank Snowden. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm delighted to be here.
And we're speaking to you. I believe you're in Rome. Is that right? You were obviously pursuing some research at the time, and got stuck.
You're absolutely right. I am in Rome. I came to do research actually on a different topic, and I did get upended by coronavirus. And in fact, I also not only had lockdown, but I also was in quarantine at home because I actually caught the virus as well. Now I'm just reassessing exactly what and when my travel plans will be.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you're feeling okay and that that's what you're contemplating. So let's jump into your book, and I know that you've been rather busy as of late because of the book and coronavirus. You write that epidemics hold a mirror up to society. Tease that out for us.
Yes, I'd be delighted to do that. I believe that the diseases that afflict a society are not random events, that in fact, we as a people, we create the channels that microbes exploit in as they move and challenge us as a people. To make the point, I might make a contrast between two separate times. Let's take first, very briefly, the Industrial Revolution, and imagine the chaos of the industrial cities, which are filling with people from the countryside in an unplanned, frenetic way, so that there's overcrowding, their hygiene is rock bottom, there are no building regulations, people live in cramped and extraordinary tenements that Dickens describes, with no running water, no safe drinking water, no sewage systems, none of that. It's in that sort of place and environment, that stage of evolution of our society, that diseases that are spread by the oral fecal route, like Asiatic cholera and typhoid, thrive. Since then, we no longer live in that world, and typhoid and cholera, because of the sanitary revolution, we have eliminated those paths for those microbes to reach us. And so you may have occasional cases, mostly travelers, but you don't have the possibility of those being big killers in New York, let us say, or Rome. So we now contrast that with the era of globalization, and that has not made us immune to these afflictions. It's simply, we live inevitably in a world of microbes, and it's a different group of microbes that are now able to challenge us successfully. We've created through the globalization, we're overpopulated. We're nearly 8 billion people in the globe. And we also have an industrial society in which we seem to believe that industrial growth infinitely is possible, although the resources of the planet are finite. Those two premises together mean that we're destroying the environment around us in a rapacious and unprecedented manner, and that means we're destroying animal habitat. That in turn means that people come into contact with animals with whom they would not have had such contact either frequently or at all in the past, and that sets the stage for what we see now of ever-increasing numbers of spillover events in which from animals that are reservoirs for various pathogens these pathogens now come into contact with people who have contact with those animals. That is the origin of the coronavirus pandemic in Wuhan. Then we have to imagine major cities, and those cities teeming and crowded and all linked by rapid air transport, where that millions of people were constantly in motion, so that a microbe that, let us say, picking a place at random on the planet at Jakarta experiences in the morning will have broken out in New York or Rome or Los Angeles by evening. And so if you put all of that together, we have now created pathways from animals we didn't know or rather have contact with in the past for those microbes to expand. They broke out in Wuhan among shoppers at a market where they had bats, and the shoppers took those microbes home with them, and they contaminated their environment at home, and it spread in clusters in apartments and apartment buildings, and then moved beyond that to neighborhoods and then whole cities. Then those microbes were, because they're spread by air, and were very vulnerable, therefore, to pulmonary viruses that are spread through the air, they were readily transmitted, and they were transmitted across the globe. And so we see this disease, to which, as a globalized society, we're extraordinarily vulnerable, is now spreading relentlessly across the globe. That's a very quick idea of how this disease is now demonstrating who we are as a global, unequal, densely populated urban civilization.
I want to stay with sort of the bigger picture, but I just want to add, like, what I learned of the Ebola virus was literally just that, like literally somebody on the edge, a child on the edge of of expansion and being exposed to, I guess it was fecal matter from bats or something.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. In fact, I would say that isn't there a message here for us that we've had avian flu a number of times beginning in 1997, and we've had MERS, we've had SARS, we've had Ebola, we have the coronavirus. The point is, these are all airborne. These are all pathogens that begin. Sorry, not all airborne. Ebola is not. But those are all pathogens that begin with animal reservoirs, and Ebola began, as you were talking about, with deforestation in West Africa, and bats that had lived in the canopy of the forest. When that was gone, they moved close to human habitations, and what happened was a 4-year-old boy was playing in the hollow of a tree where bats had found refuge and were roosting, nesting in the thousands, and with their excrement dropping down to the bottom of the tree, the boy breathed in the virus, and he then took it home, and it then spread to his family, neighbors, and the neighbors worked in the big city, and so soon you had this. That's the origin of all of the cases in West Africa in the Ebola epidemic there.
And so, I mean, as I've read some of your book, the idea of human beings just being sort of like almost like a circuit, and the society that we build at any given time, the way that we're organizing just changes the path of the circuit essentially. And so, I mean, is that why we get pandemics, or is that why the pandemics like this are sometimes, sort of clustered on some level, because society sort of responds to the way that it is made up and the circuit that it's created for something like this to pass, and then over time it starts to go further in a different direction that creates new vulnerabilities?
I would like what you said, 90% I'm very enthusiastic. I do believe we create the circuits exactly as you said, and microbes exploit those, and the circuits that are created depend on the world that we've created. Epidemics are not hitting us randomly. They are exploiting fault lines that we ourselves have created. But what I wanted to add to that I think is critical, particularly looking at today's events, is that this is not something that was doomed to happen. What happens when we're challenged, the challenge was inevitable, but there was every possibility of being prepared for this particular challenge, this what has now become a pandemic of coronavirus. We have been receiving warnings from epidemiologists, virologists, public health officials for 25 years, well, since 1997, all saying that an event like this was inevitable. To me, the most disturbing sentence, actually a question, of the entire outbreak was the question phrased by President Trump, in which he asked, who could have known? In my opinion, everyone should have known, because the world was warned. We had a number of, if you like, dress rehearsals with avian flu, SARS, Ebola, MERS, and in 2005, we had testimony before Congress, which was considering a pandemic emergency, and it's extraordinary to read now. They actually more or less predicted what we're now facing, right. That Fauci, in fact, and the Director General then of the CDC, Julie Gerberding, actually testified before the Senate, and they used the analogy of a hurricane. They said that if you live in the Caribbean, meteorologists can tell you that a hurricane is coming. Scientifically, it's certain. They can't tell you when and how strong the hurricane will be, but they know that it's coming. They said in exactly the same way, virologists can tell you that a pulmonary pandemic challenge is coming. They can't tell you how terrible it will be, and they can't give you a date. But its coming is inevitable, and just as in the hurricane situation, it would be extremely important to prepare for it. And that's, in fact, what we didn't do.
Right.
There was a flurry of preparation in 2005 to 7, a flurry around Ebola, but then everything went back literally to business as usual with cost cutting and all of the vulnerabilities. So I would say that this is a catastrophe of unpreparedness as much as it is simply of an epidemic challenge that was inevitable. The point is we did very, very little, too late and too little to prevent it. This was a preventable pandemic.
And just to reiterate, when you say pulmonary, that is an indication on some level that we shored up as a world, I guess, broadly speaking, issues of sanitation and like, just like basic I guess hygiene on some level, right? I mean, because if we still had that problem, we'd be susceptible to something that would be more transmittable through such means. But because we closed off that avenue, or not just because we closed off that avenue, but because we're susceptible to air issues, and our air travels literally from, like you say, from Jakarta to Chicago in an airplane, then we're susceptible to something like that.
That's right. We are susceptible exactly to something like that. It was what's scary about 2005 to 7, and listening now to Fauci and to Gerberding, is that they actually identify specifically that this will be a pulmonary pandemic virus that will challenge us. And they actually, then there is discussion of what might that look like and what are our vulnerabilities. And the extraordinary thing is the vulnerabilities are listed there in the discussion before the US Senate. It was known what needed to be done. And the tragedy of this is that we did not do it as a world and as a country.
Let's talk a little bit about you mentioned that sort of that modernity has created these sort of pathways, right? That sort of dictate the flow, if you will, of a pandemic. What about how wealth inequality? What about the sort of when we talk about modernity, we're talking about technology in terms of travel and advances in some areas and not in others. But what about sort of and I guess, I'm trying not to limit it to my perspective in the United States, but broadly speaking, this is an issue around the globe. How does wealth inequality implicate that?
I'm delighted that you raised that, because that is another part of our globalized world, which is to say that since the Second World War, the inequality between social classes has broadened exponentially through the industrial world on the one hand, and between the developed nations of the industrial world and the developing nations of the industrial world. And so you have two fault lines of inequality. One, if you like, let's look at the example of the United States. And initially it sounds as though a disease transmitted through the air is, should we say, a democratic equal opportunity infection. It's true. It can make anyone ill. All you have to do is be present at the wrong time at the wrong place and to be breathing, and you breathe in the air exhaled by a patient. You share that air and you incorporate the microbes into your lungs. So that can happen to anyone. And initially it seemed as though skiers, holidaymakers, we heard about Prince Charles, Boris Johnson, Tom Hanks. It seemed elite members of society were very vulnerable. But actually, that's misleading. That was the early part of the disease. And what we've seen since is that it is, in fact, people who are impoverished, who are disadvantaged economically, who are overwhelmingly becoming sick and dying. If you look at the figures for Manhattan, it clearly shows, or New York City as a whole, that you can map the virus victims by illness or death over the disadvantaged zip codes. And it's those places that are particularly suffering. And African Americans and Hispanics in New York City have experienced this disease, contracting it at twice the rate of the white population of New York City. And this is happening for really simple reasons. One, the lack of access to medical care. And that if you live in a inner city ghetto and you don't have the possibility of doing what we've all been told, which is to practice social distancing. How do you social distance in an overcrowded housing development in which not only do you share the common space with lots of people, but also, in addition to that, there is terrible hygienic conditions, and washing your hands and all of that is not really so easy. So domestically, it's a major issue that this is preferentially attacking people, the poor, and the poor have a greater burden of pre-existing conditions of obesity, heart disease, high blood pressure, that in so many cases, if they're not covered by insurance, they aren't being treated for those. So those are good reasons that the poor in our country are suffering. But then if you look on the international level, it's also entirely the case that we're seeing this disease, which started in China, then moved to Europe, and then over to North America. It's now moving, rampaging in the poorer countries of the world. And this brings into question the fact that over decades, those countries, I don't mean they're becoming poor absolutely, but relatively compared to the industrial world, there is a process of growing distance in advantages. And you have, imagine preaching the idea of social distancing in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, right, or in the townships of South Africa, or in the shawls of Mumbai, where it's impossible because of the extraordinary overcrowding, the lack of guaranteed water, the lack of soap. All of those mean that this disease is running rampant in the third world, and it's setting off as a secondary, very possible consequence, one that the UN has sounded an alarm. This may lead to massive famine in Africa and in Latin America, and social calamities and tensions and all that follow in their wake. So poverty, we can't really discuss this disease with accurately and explain its epidemiology unless we include poverty within it.